Hello, my name is Andy Harris. I have taught computer programming in various languages for several years, and I am the person who was featured on a very popular YouTube video called How to Start Thinking Like a Programmer. And what I want to do in this video is take one particular question that came up in that talk, and I hear all the time, and I see on Reddit Learn Programming English all the time, and I want to take this one question and take it quite a bit deeper. And that question is, what programming language should I start with? And it seems like such a simple question, but it has caused all kinds of anxiety among professional programming teachers as well as just people trying to get started. And so, what I want to do today is I want to take a look at a number of languages that are popularly used as beginning languages, and I want to show you how we would do exactly the same program in all these languages. And I'm going to explain two things that seem to be contradictory in my talk. And one is my assertion that the language is not the thing you should be worried about. But the second is, but if you do worry about it, there's one language that I find quite a bit better for beginners than others. And the reasons may surprise you. So let's take a look. Now I'm going to start with a couple of assumptions here. The first assumption I'm going to make is that we don't care about which operating system you happen to be using. Just for the sake of making it easy for me, I'm working in a form of Ubuntu Linux, but that's simply because I'm very nerdy. I want languages that work in all major languages, and that work equally well in all major languages. So there are some languages like Swift and C Sharp, which are quite a bit better in one operating system than another. So I'm going to say my first thing is I'm interested in languages that are that work on all major operating systems. Secondly, I'm looking only for free languages that have compilers or interpreters that are available for free. You could find them online, something like Replit. You shouldn't have to buy anything. A third assumption I'm making is that I'm not even worried about IDE versus editor questions yet. That'll be another video, because I think we tend to get ourselves all tied up in exactly what editor you should use, or whether you should use an IDE, and how you configure Visual Studio Code or Vim or whatever you're using. I will say that for the sake of this example, for speed, I'm using Vim because that's what I like. But that's not really what I'm talking about. So really, any multi-purpose editor should work for any of these languages. And of course, you might want to get some sort of an editor, an IDE that is specific to a particular language. But you shouldn't feel like that's your limiting situation, because, whatever you learn, your teacher may not use that, or you may be in another environment. So I'm going to separate out questions about which editor to use from questions about which language you should use, because they're two different things. And I, just for the sake of my argument, I'm going to use one of the cleanest, most bare bones editor, which I do not necessarily recommend for beginners. Feel free to, but that's not really the point right now. So let's take a look at what we want to solve, right? People want to learn programming because they want to solve problems. And if you've seen my other video, you know that my basic idea is usually we get way too concerned with how we're going to do it rather than really deciding what it is we want to do. And my basic assumption, the key to all of my teaching is there's really only a few main things you do in any language. And when you understand those things and you know how to put those things together in a good way, then you can move to any language you wish. Okay, let me show you. I'm gonna give an example of that here, and we'll start with this. Okay, so I'm just going to describe a problem in English that I want to do. Okay, the easiest one I can think of that actually shows you something. Now, traditionally we do a program called Hello World. The problem with Hello World is it's so simple that you really can't see the distinction between languages. So I'm going to call it Hello User. So what it's going to do is slightly more sophisticated. I want to ask the user's name, and then I want to give user a personalized greeting. So the first form of any sort of problem solving is you write down sort of what the problem is. in English or whatever language you prefer. Mainly English is me. So that's pretty good. That's pretty good. Now, that is not specific enough to turn into computer code. And the key to learning how to program is what's called algorithms, and that is, how do you restate this statement in terms of the 7 or 8 main ideas that computers can do in programming languages. And I'm going to say there's really going to be only 2 today. So we're just going to look at 2 main ideas. Okay, 3. One is we need variables, right? So we need some place to store stuff in memory. Another thing we need to do is know how we give output. How do we tell the user something? How do we do input? How do we get something from the user? And there are many, many other things, but those are 3 of the biggest things. I haven't written very many programs that don't use those. So we're going to start by deliberately limiting our programs to only needing a few basic ideas. How do I make a variable? How do I get input? How do I get output? But what you really need to do is write a program that you'll be interested in. Yeah, okay, yeah, you won't be interested in when you keep failing. So let's actually start with something simplistic that we can understand and get done, and then we'll build on that. And sure, we'll make your, we'll make your neural network that solves tic-tac-toe across the universe and solves world hunger soon enough, but maybe not today. All right, so let's restate this in terms of the very basic ideas that we may be interested in. Here's one. Make sure we can do input and output. That seems silly. What sort of a program wouldn't allow us to do input and output? Well, you might be surprised. Many programming languages actually require you to do something in order to make sure that you can do input and output. And that's one of the key issues we'll talk about as we're choosing a programming language, is how much stuff does it make you do that's sort of sideways to the real problem you're trying to solve. How do I make sure I can go from an algorithm to code? For a beginner, that's the most important thing. And a lot of languages will make you do some other things to get there. All right, so make sure we can do input and output. Now what are we going to do? We're going to ask the user for her name. Okay, and we're going to put that name in a variable. Somehow in memory, that'll be a variable. And then we're going to print a greeting containing the name. This seems so simple. You might be like, I'll always remember this. There's no need for me to write it down. Write it down. I'm just telling you, if you have failed at learning to program and you haven't done this step, I know why you failed. Because soon enough, they'll get more complex. But start here where it's easy. And what I've done here is I've taken every one of the things that I want this problem to do, and I've broken it down into a line or 2 of English that helps me understand what it is I intend to do. And my guess is you'll get better at this with more experience. But how do I know that this is good enough? Well, I am pretty sure that in almost any language, I can turn that line of comment into a line of code. And that's exactly what we're looking at, is we want to write our algorithms. It could be comments, it could be just text. We want to write our algorithms in a way that every line of algorithm is only a line or 2 of text. And we can Google to figure out how to do that in every language. We can't Google how to get this. Not typically. And so the real key to programming isn't memorizing code in a dozen languages. The real key to programming is, can you write steps that are this clear? And I'll prove it to you. I'll show you how I can take this basic idea and convert it into workable code in 4 or 5 different languages. Stay tuned. We'll do it. Okay, so does that make sense? That's what we want to do. And the first thing we do is we write it just in plain text, which is pretty wonderful. Okay, so let's take a look at some typically used programming languages. I know a few, so we can do those. Let's do C. C's fun. Again, I'm going to presume, for the sake of argument, that somebody's already set up a system for you to write C code and compile it. So I'm just kind of not worried about that right now. It's really not that distinct of a difference language to language. There's always ways to do it. So in C, let's take a look at some C code here. Here's how I would do this. I want you to know there's going to be a lot of details I'm not going to explain. You okay with that? Okay, so the first thing we need to do is be sure we can do input and output. In C, you have to bring in a library. It's called standardIO.h. I'm not going to explain the details of it. You just have to know that's something that happens. And then we have to have a function called main. Often it looks a little more complex than that, but I'm going to simplify it. Okay, and in C is what's called a very low-level language, and what that means is you really need to understand how the computer memory works. And so what I'm telling it right there is, hey, I want you to reserve enough room in memory to store 20 characters. This is one of the best things about C, and it's one of the worst things about C. And that is you really need to understand the underlying computer memory model, or you're going to cause just disasters. The good news is when you do understand the memory model, you can control it super precise. C is like a scalpel language. It's really great for precision. I wouldn't want to mow a lawn with a scalpel. All right, so we'll do that. We're going to say, okay, so ask the user for name. And there's a couple of ways, but the most common way to do this, we have to start in C with an output. Printf, what is your name? And why is it called printf? It just is. But that asks the user for the name. Now we need to get the name. That's a different command. And in C we would do this way, scanf. That means I'm expecting string of characters. I'm expecting some sort of string input. And then the place in memory where I want to put that data. So the good news is this is very, very precise. The bad news is you probably would not have guessed this. What's the $S? Or I'm sorry, the %S and the 20 and the braces. And there's nothing wrong with this. It's actually quite beautiful. But it is a little bit different than just our text. And so the translation from text to working code is a little trickier. And I'm not quite done yet. We want to print out a greeting. And I'll do another printf. Hi there, $S from C. Okay, that's kind of fun. I might have screwed something up, but I don't think so. I'm going to do one more thing. I'm going to put in a new line character so that looks good. Return 0 and main. So if you've never programmed in C before, you have lots of questions, which I am not going to answer right now. Because the point isn't how does all this thing work? The point is there's a lot you need to know to get your head in the space where you can translate from, say, these comments, the // lines, to C code. And that's not bad. That's not bad at all. But it is something you need to know. If your first language is C, you're going to be spending some time getting into the space where you can understand, you can translate ideas to code, and that is not a bad thing. But as we compare this to some other languages, you will see that there may be languages that can get you more quickly to success. And that, to me, is a pretty important thing. So let's go ahead. I'm going to write this. Again, I'm not going to worry about compilation because it's pretty equivalent in most languages. Okay, so we'll compile this to C. Oh, what did I do wrong? Oh, I was trying to compile the the other one. That's kind of funny. All right. GCC hello.c. I think I'll do that way. All right. What have I done wrong? Okay. Oh, silly me. Okay. There's going to be syntax errors, any language. And one of the things you need to know when you're learning a new language is, does the syntax error help you, or does the error message help you solve the problem? And C is famous for obtuse error messages. Now, I've programmed in this language enough that I can tell what went wrong. But that's another thing you want to think about when you're choosing a language is, if I get an error message, will I be able to tell what it is that went wrong? And in C, I would argue, until you've done a good amount of C programming, you probably won't. Okay. All right. Yeah, and I made a mistake here too. That happens when you do in a lot of languages at once. I need to tell it what I'm putting in there, username. Okay. All right, that time it didn't complain. And now I can run it. What is your name? Andy. Hi there, Andy, from C. It works. Now, you see, first of all, I had errors. I'm always going to have errors. The goal is not to write code without errors. That is not a reasonable goal. The goal is to have your errors be solvable and to have error messages that kind of can point you to what it went wrong. And in any language, there's a learning process. But I was able to get there. Now, there's something interesting about this. I'm going to run it again. What is your name? If I say Andy Harris, it will skip my last name. It just says, hi there, Andy. And that has to do with some of the assumptions that the C language used about how we end inputs, and it's a very solvable issue. But again, when all you wanted to do was do input and output, there's a lot you had to learn to get successful in that in C. And this doesn't mean that C is a bad language or even a bad language for beginners. What I feel like is, compared to some of the things you're going to see later, C makes you do a lot of work to get success. And I've been programming for how many years and still made multiple mistakes because it's not an obvious system. Now, it's fun. And when you get used to it, it's a lot of fun. If all I'm doing is C in a day, I tend to not make as many of those syntax errors. But they're there. Okay, let's take a look at another popular language. Let's do C++. Okay, so C++ is similar to C. It's a lot of the same ideas. In fact, it's a superset on top of C. But the main addition was this notion of object-oriented programming. Which we're not going to do. In C++, you can choose to use object-oriented style, or you can choose to use the more traditional procedural style like C uses. So let's just go procedural, and we'll just find the closest version of this program in C++. So we're looking at the same general problems, right? The first thing we want to do is figure out, how do we enable input and output? And again, you have to turn this on in C++. There's a couple of ways, but I'm going to use this one. Include IO stream. We can do it the C style, but the IO stream is these objects that simplify doing input and output. Well, that's great news, right? Yeah, that is great news. So it's going to be a little bit easier, I think. It'll also have its own weirdness. So let's go ahead and, again, we have to make a function that tells it, hey, this is what I want you to do when you start. And then same idea we had before, right? We need to reserve space in memory to contain the name. And so, all right, turns out there's a way to do that in C++. It's a little simpler. You say standard : : string name. Now, the first thing is, okay, why is it a string? Well, there's historical reasons. And why do I have to say standard : string? Well, this is what happens, especially in C++, is you can get yourself into a lot of rabbit holes about some details. There's other ways of writing it that don't require the standard string, but then you have conversations about namespace pollution. And I'm just telling you, when I teach in C++ to beginners, a lot of times I run into some of the same issues I deal when I'm teaching in C. There's lots and lots of details that you really need to understand, and they're important and they're useful, but they can get in your way of success. And so for now, I would just say, well, don't you even worry about that. You just type standard : string. And later on, I will explain to you what a namespace is and what this standard, what a scope modifier is, and why we don't use using namespace standard, which you'll see in some code. That's just how it is. So let's keep going. Okay, the next thing we wanted to do is we wanted to ask the user's name, right? And well, in C++, you can do it this way. Standard cout. This cute little operator means something's going to cout, and cout means the output, the console output. Okay, we're going to ask him a question. What is your name? And then that's it. And then we need to get the input. Notice I'm using the same pattern in every program. So input will do standard cin. Now this time, the arrows go the other way to help me understand that there's a flow of data coming from cin to some variable. Okay, that's pretty great. And then we're going to output our greeting. So standard cout. Hi there. Now, this is really cool. What we can do here is we can also append to that output the name, and append to that an exclamation point, or let's do from C++, exclamation point, and then we can do standard endl, which means the end of the line. And then again, just because it's the tradition, we're going to do return 0 to indicate there were no errors. And that's the same program written in C++. Is it easier? Is it harder? Yes. It's easier and it's harder. It's a different set of things, a different set of assumptions, a different set of syntax ideas you have to get right. And again, the syntax isn't gonna kill us because the error messages will probably help. But the best way to resolve an error message is to not have one. And the most important thing when you're learning to code is making sure you understand how to translate from an algorithm to the actual code. And I would argue that at this level, C++ is way better than C, and not too difficult. Now, where C++ does get quite a bit more complex is when we start creating our own objects. And it's a great language for that, but you really, again, have to know what you're doing. The other thing about C++ is you also really need to understand how memory works. And you can get yourself in some significant trouble in C++ if you just code and don't really understand how memory works, the difference between, say, the heap and the stack, and how to manage memory well. So you really need to know a lot more in order to be successful. Let's prove it. Yeah, I'm saying successful, but let's see if that's working. Compile in C++. Woo, worked the first time. Okay, that's good news. And then I'll run it in C++ and see how does that work. What is your name? Andy. Hi there, Andy from C++. Now I'm curious. One thing is, I'd like there to be an extra space there, so I'll fix that. Okay, put the space there. The other thing is, I wonder if it has the same problem. Okay, no, I didn't write it. Write it. Compile. C++. Okay, let's run it. What is your name? What if I do the same thing? Andy Harris. It still has the same problem, is that it stops reading it when it comes to a space. Is there a solution to this? Yes. But I would argue for a beginner, that's not the sort of thing you want to worry about. You just want to be able to type in your name and get the whole name. So is C++ a bad language for beginners? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a great language. I have taught many people using C++ as the first language. But we spend a lot of time understanding all of these details. And frankly, C++, because it has been in continuous development for well over 30 years, has inconsistent syntax, which really confuses people. So although it is a terrific language, it's not my favorite first language just because it tends to make people feel stupid for the wrong reasons. And so I love C++ as a second language. It's my favorite second language to teach because there's so many really, really neat things you can learn from it. I would argue also I like C as a second language. But as a first language, it has some problems. So let's take a look at another language. Want to see another one? Let's see. More recently, people will teach programming using Java. So let's take a look at Java. Okay, so Java has it was some very different design constraints from C++, and it was developed as a response to C++. It was for quite a long time the most popular language to teach beginners, and I have taught many, many beginners in Java. In a lot of ways, I think it is a more sensible and consistent language. It is one of my favorite languages to actually write working code in. But it also has some problems for beginners. And so let me just show you how I'm going to implement exactly the same algorithm in Java. Okay, so the first thing I need to do is the same thing I was doing in the other languages. I need to make sure I have a way of importing the input and output system. So here's how we do that in Java. Now, strictly, that's not entirely true. I'm importing an entire different library, and there's differences between the way Java does imports and C++ does includes, and we don't care. But that's an important thing. Now, Java requires you to be an object-oriented programming. And so Java has a lot of rules. And if you don't follow the rules, it'll just not compile. So again, it kind of gets in your way. Now, it's teaching you good habits. That's the good news. But if you don't follow those rules, well, you just don't go. And one of the rules of Java is that everything is an object. You can't write a program that doesn't use objects. Well, objects are a wonderful thing that I like to teach around midterm. The problem with Java is we have to teach object-oriented programming, or at least a form of it, on day one. So okay, so that's something we do first, and then we have to do this. Public static void main string args. What? Okay. I love Java, but this is my least favorite line in all of Java, because what this is it's just the instructions for how to make main. And I've used main in C and C++, right? Main was just a function that happens right away. What's a function? I don't want to talk about that yet. But in Java, not only do you have to make a function, you have to make a function in the context of a class, and the function has to be written exactly this way. You get one thing wrong, it won't work. And I don't want to explain to you right now why it has to be public and static and void, and what the string square braces and what args is. I don't want to talk about that yet, because it's not important in the context of hello username. But this is one of the things that Java brings. It has a certain amount of overhead that you have to get. And most programming teachers, when they teach Java, they're just like, copy and paste this. It's a ritual. Don't worry, I'll explain it all later, but I don't want to explain it today. I mean, I could, and that would be a good argument for why you don't want to hear it. So you just type it. Okay, now let's take a look at how we're going to do what we want to do. Well, we want to get input from the user. In Java, you have to create an object to get input. You don't have to, but it's the easiest way. So I'll do scanner input gets new scanner system.in. That's a good way to do it. Okay, and then we'll create a string to contain the username. And then we'll say username. Oh no, we'll ask the user. So system.out.println. That's the easiest way to print out a line of code. Or we'll just do print. What is your name? Space. Okay. And then we'll say username gets input.next. So the structure of this code is a little bit different, as you can tell. You can still see the basic ideas I'm doing, and of course I had memorized some commands. There's no question about that, but that's not actually the hard part. Now I want to print out my greeting, so system.out.println. Hi there. I can use the plus sign here to combine various things. Username plus from Java. And that should work. And then I have to end main and class. So what's really happening here, and again, if I'm just absolutely overwhelming you with details, that's kind of the point. That's not a bad thing. Writing in Java is good. It is very sensible. It's a terrific language, but it also requires you to understand the Java way of thinking, which puts new constraints about you and has a lot of really important rules that can trip up a beginner. Like if I don't save this file with exactly the right name, with exactly the right capitalization, it will refuse to compile. Oh my goodness. Yeah. These are good things. Like all the languages. Have you heard me say that any of these languages is bad? No, they're great. I love them all. But for beginners, they all have the same general flaw, which is there's a lot of other things you need to know before you can get success. And that gets in the way for beginners quite often. Still, it's good language. Good language. Let's go ahead and try to compile it. Compile it to Java. Okay, it works. And run it as Java. What is your name, Andy? Hi there, Andy from Java. Let's try the other thing. So far, all of our languages have failed the Andy Harris text. So let's try that again. Okay, Andy Harris. It can handle it. It can handle it. Okay. So that's good. That's Java. And again, it is still, as of last year, I was still teaching it to beginners. And so it's not a bad language. It's quite sensible. It's very complete. It's a wonderful language to use. But there are things you need to know in order to use it. Okay, let's do two more languages. Let's take a look. JavaScript, which is not Java. It's a totally different language, as you'll see. It's very confusing. They seem similar, but they're not. So JavaScript is a different language. And the crazy thing about JavaScript is that it typically only works in the context of the internet. So 90% of the time when you're talking about JavaScript, it's embedded in a web page. And occasionally you'll see it on a web server. Well, I don't want to deal with that today. So I'll show you hello JavaScript and see how that language compares. Okay, so we'll do. Wait a minute. I thought we were writing JavaScript and I wrote an HTML. Yeah, that's the biggest advantage and disadvantage of JavaScript, is that it typically only lives in another context. It lives in the context usually of a web page and sometimes of a web server. So in order to write JavaScript code, I really have to write an HTML page. So before you can even do JavaScript, you have to know another language. It's an easier language, but it is another language. So I'll go ahead and write some quick boilerplate HTML. Okay. Using what's called HTML5. You'll never memorize this. Great. You don't really need to. I mean, you will if you take an HTML5 class. But you can tell just from here that by one of my standards, which is the how much do I have to know before I even get to the good stuff? Well, there's a lot. None of it's super hard. You could learn it quite easily. Go ahead and finish. If you know about anything about HTML, this is one of the worst HTML web pages you've ever seen. There is nothing in the body. Now, you need to know this about JavaScript, that it is typically designed to use in close proximity with a web page. So it's a totally different style of programming. It's more like graphic user interface programming. And so in order to compare it more clearly with these other languages, I'm going to treat it more like a console style language. And I'll show you what I mean. So var username gets prompt, what is your name? And then alert, hi there, plus username, JavaScript. JavaScript is just like Java in the same way that a car is just like a carpet. So as you see, the language may have some similarities, but not really. It was an unfortunate, deliberate set of confusion on the part of the people who first wrote JavaScript, Brandon Ike. Okay, so this one we also will run differently. In order to actually run this program, we have to take a web page and load it up into a browser. So let me see, that's not where those pages are. Let me go find where I had that web page on my what langs. There it is. And then I'll take this hello.html and I will drag it over to my browser. And it did not work. That happens sometimes. Let's make sure I've saved it properly. Oh. Let's try it again. Go find that guy. You can see there's some complexity here, but that's just life. There we go. What is your name? Andy. And it should have said hello, Andy, and it didn't. Let's see what's wrong. There's error codes we can look for. Username is not defined. Oh, I used a capital U here. A lowercase u there. Okay, and so now we'll try it again. Refresh to tell it I've made some changes. Andy. Hi there, Andy from JavaScript. So you can see that JavaScript is a relatively straightforward language compared to the others we've done. I don't have to explicitly bring in tools for input and output. What took 7 or 8 lines in some other languages I could do in 2 lines, but they're a little bizarre, right? I've got the prompt and the alert. And so there's a lot of details to learn, but you can agree it's the same general thing. The big problem with JavaScript is it only lives in the context of the web page. And so there's kind of a lot you have to do to even get to the point where you can write programs. There's a couple of other things about JavaScript I find a little weird, especially as you start getting into more advanced things, like object-oriented programming and so on. So it's a good language. I've taught this to beginners as well, but it has some issues. So far, every language that I've showed you has had problems and has been difficult to compile or to convert. Remember, here was originally what we started with. And so let's see, wouldn't it be great if there was a language that was really easy to convert from this idea to code that works? Well, I'm going to do one. Okay, so let's take a look at exactly the same program written in Python. Looking at Python 3 specifically. Okay, so it's been a little bit. Okay, so we'll do this. Username gets input. What is your name? Well, that was a pretty easy way, because not only I actually made the variable and used it in the same line. That's pretty easy. And now we could just print out. I'll do it this way first. I don't want a comma there. The F is the only thing here that I think is the slightest bit confusing. So we create the username. We have the input statement, which just gets us input. We type out a question. It prints it. Whatever the user types gets put into username. And then we can print out hi there. And here's the cool thing. That F allows me to say, hey, in the squiggle braces, I'm going to put a variable. Just put the variable in there. Let's see if it works before we get too excited. Okay. What is your name? Andy. Hi there, Andy from Python. Let's try the other thing. See if it handles spaces. Hi there, Andy Harris from Python. This is pretty exciting. So if the goal of beginning programming is to be able to get from an algorithm to working code, at one level, it doesn't matter what language you use, because all languages have the features that allow you to go from algorithm to code. That's the good news. So in one sense, the language doesn't matter. But in another sense, the language matters a lot, because the amount of difficulty of getting from algorithm to code changes vastly based on which language you're in. And many languages, in fact, every language makes you adhere to a certain set of standards about how to get in the mind space of that language. There's assumptions about how you work in C or C++ or Java, and in fact in Python. But the reason that I now, given a choice, tend to teach in Python first is because that transition from algorithm to code is easier in modern Python than in any other language that I use today. Are there other languages that make it as easy? Yeah, a few of them. But you can see this is pretty straightforward. Now, I would argue that Python probably shouldn't be your last language. It's great as a first language, but some of these other languages are better at different things. C and C++ produce much more streamlined code, for example, that tends to run faster. Java is amazing at working with very, very large, complex projects with multiple programmers. JavaScript is the only language you can count on working in every web page. So it's got its own advantages. So I would definitely learn these other languages as well. But you can see now why I would argue that Python is such a great language for teaching beginners, because I don't believe that teaching the syntax of a language was ever the goal of beginning programming. The goal of beginning programming is to learn how to write an algorithm and how to convert that algorithm to code that works. And if you had to learn one of these 5 approaches, which one would you prefer? Right. I want the one that is less likely to astonish me and less likely to get me in trouble and most likely to get me to having success. Because, we've only used really 3 main ideas right now. Create a variable, input from the user, output to the user. There's a few other ideas we're going to need, and in all these cases, the same idea exists in every language, yet its implementation is different. And in Python, it tends to be simpler in all cases. So what are the other things we need to know how to do? I would argue you need to know how to do basic operations, mathematical operations like add, subtract, multiply, divide, text operations like changing the case, combining strings, and so on. So operations. Another thing that you'll need in pretty much any language is conditions. How do I make decisions? And there's a couple variations of that. Then loops. How do I repeat things? In most languages, there's two main kinds of loops, and there's a few others. And then I would say aggregating. So aggregating code means writing functions. Some languages, you can't do anything without functions. Some languages, you can't. You can just start writing code, like in Python. And that would take us to other things like more advanced data structures, arrays, and dictionaries, and so on. And then finally, things like object-oriented programming, which is a really powerful, important idea, but it's not one that you need to start with as a beginner. So I hope this helped answer some questions. And again, of course, I'd be happy to spend more time talking about details like how do you install all these things in various operating systems? How do you pick a good editor? How do you compile or interpret, and what is the difference? But from my point of view here, the real question is, how do we make sure that beginners have the best possible experience? And is there a language choice that can get us there? I would argue that for now, Python is probably the best way to get there. All right, thanks. Let me know what you think. I'll talk to you later.